As a cinematographer, exposure charts are for idiots. I'm sorry, that's a lie. This is why, as a cinematographer, I don't use exposure charts. Well, I use them, but Alright, that's a little bit misleading, but all I'm saying is that there are certain things that beginner cinematographers do that make their shots look cheap. So in this video, we're going to talk about 3 tips that nobody talks about when it comes to exposure. When you're first starting out, you may get your exposure wrong, maybe under or overexposing. You then learn about the exposure triangle and how to expose properly. But that's just the half of it. Let's say that you're watching Batman and you realize that most of the shots are really dark. It looks underexposed. Well, let's get this out of the way. Some shots are underexposed and some are shot to look underexposed. There's a difference between a cinematographer actually underexposing and a cinematographer lighting to make it feel and look underexposed. My concern was that it might be too hard to see anything, so I scoured the internet for images that were dark but easy to see. Those references informed certain decisions, like making sure there were almost always pools of light or bright areas in the frame. There's always a look and aesthetic that comes with a movie or something you're shooting. And that's where a lot of beginner cinematographers get it wrong. And now I usually see this when I see videographers going to cinematography. In videography, you just want it to be perfectly exposed. Now, exposing by the charts don't mean that it's right or wrong, it's just that's what it is. So when you put it on auto on your camera, that's just technically getting it exposed, right? Making sure you have your whites, making sure you have your blacks, and all the midtones and grays are there. If you look at majority of my shots, I like to underexpose. I like very dark blacks and I like contrast. So I don't really have that many highlights in my videos, but I do make sure that I have highlights and I make sure I have shadows and all that. I know that that's my taste and I know that's what helps me get my story forward for these shots. Now, do I underexpose for every single shot? No. I'm gonna keep this part really short and sweet, but stop overexposing and stop blowing out your highlights. Get yourself an ND filter, get yourself a reflector, get yourself more light. Whatever it is, just don't blow out your highlights, especially when you're outside and the sky is overexposed. That is the #1 way to tell if somebody's a beginner or not. There are certain times when you can overexpose. It actually is very common in cinematography to overexpose, but it's in certain situations. You don't want to overexpose when you don't have to overexpose. Like if you're inside and you're shooting towards a window, sometimes that window will be overexposed and sometimes it doesn't look bad. If you will have a light in the shot, sometimes that might be overexposed and it might add to the cinematography of it. But if you are overexposed and you're outside, it tends to look cheap because most of the time it's like you didn't know how to combat the sun or you didn't know how to combat a certain thing. Most cameras nowadays are so good that you can just point it anywhere and it looks good. But the people who put concept behind their shots are the ones who are going to advance into their career and advance how their art is. With that being said, you really need to know the camera that you're working with. There's 2 factors that you just need to know about a camera, and that's dynamic range and that's ISO. ISO refers to the sensitivity of the camera's sensor. Native ISO is the range of ISO settings that cameras can produce without any extra digital manipulation. Dynamic range is the ratio between the whitest values and the blackest values within an image. The more dynamic range you have, the more details you can capture in scenes with a great contrast between lights and darks. So for most cameras, you're going to have a dynamic range number and you're going to have a native ISO. For example, I know that my Panasonic S1 that I'm shooting on right now, the native ISO is 640. So I'm going to expose my camera around 640 and everything around my camera is what I'm going to change. This is what's going to make you a better cinematographer. Not just the camera, but understanding your camera, leaving the camera functions there and then operating everything else around that. The same with dynamic range. You need to understand your camera's capabilities. Dynamic range is a very important number to know because if you don't want your image muddy, you want to be able to tweak it in post, all these other factors, you need to know your dynamic range and you need to know where to expose your camera in order to get the most out of it. So again, I know that if I'm shooting in a color profile that's V-log, which is a log flat profile, I know that I need to overexpose a little bit, but I have to compensate for also how I like my videos to look. Right now, I'm actually overexposing 1 1/3, but that's because I can control it because it has so much dynamic range. I can control it and pull it back a little bit in post. I know the capabilities of my camera and I can use it like that in order to get the best quality, in order to get how I want my image to look, and just everything around it. I just know my camera enough to set the settings where it needs to be. And that's what's gonna help you advance as a cinematographer. The last tip I'm gonna leave y'all with is motivation. No, not like motivation as in like, oh, I gotta get up and get to shooting. No, like motivational lighting. A lot of beginner cinematographers lack motivation. A lot of beginner cinematographers don't take into consideration what they are shooting. What is the concept? What do you want the viewer to feel? What genre is it? There's a whole bunch of things that you and the director can come up with about how you want it to feel. How do you want it to look? How do you want the viewer to feel? There's a lot of things that go into lighting and cinematography that's just not setting up a camera. Simple little things like, is it a comedy? Is it lit high key like this, where everything is bright? Or is it more contrasted and dark like this? It's really up to you. That is your job as the cinematographer. What do you want the viewer to feel and how to portray that through the lens? What are movies that you like? Look at movies and break it down. And that is the best way you learn, and that's the best way for you to figure out what other ways are there to portray what you're looking for. How do you get this story told visually? So next time when you're about to shoot, make sure that you're planning out your shot. Why is it underexposed? Why are you exposing like this? How do you want it to feel? Because that is the most important part. Cinematography is all about aiding to the story. So whatever that story is and whatever you want the audience to feel, you can represent that through how you expose, as simple as that. You can do it through lighting. You can do it through where you put your aperture. All of this is something you need to take into context in order to get that shot that you want for your audience to feel and for you to get that story out visually. So those are my tips for beginner cinematographers. Make sure next time you have a project, think about the concept of it, think about how you want to light it, think about how you want to direct it, think about how you want the audience to feel. So if you like videos like this and you want to see more, comment below, leave a like, and make sure that you subscribe. It'll help me out a lot. Thank you, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one.